Okay,
Are you ready?
yep.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the public PhD defense of Joshua Vincent. Joshua came to ASU about 5 years ago and joined my research group and has been working on um, electron microscopy of catalysts, in particular looking at dynamic changes in the catalysts that are connected to the catalytic properties that are important for energy conversion applications. And so he's going to give a presentation now for about 45 minutes, summarizing what he's done over the last 5 years. And then, for those of you that are not familiar with the process, this is a public defense, so he presents to the public. The public then get to ask questions, and then we'll ask the public to leave, and then he'll meet privately with the examiner. So, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Peter. I'm really excited to talk about the work that I've done during my PhD thesis, which centers on, as Peter said, advanced electron microscopy of catalysts. So the title of my thesis is Atomic Resolution In Situ and Operando Visualization of Oxygen Transfer Reactions over Platinum Ceria Catalysts. And in this talk, I'll be going through four different stories, four different research projects underneath of this overall thesis. I'll start by giving some background and motivation to the work before delving into each of the individual projects before closing out with a couple of ideas I have about potential paths forward for the research. So to give a little bit of background to oxygen transfer reactions, a lot of catalytic applications involve oxygen transfer reactions where we're interested in transferring oxygen into different molecules or out of different molecules to for different applications. So for example, in a catalytic converter, which is on every car for exhaust emission control, we're interested in removing pollutants, say, from the exhaust. And a lot of technologies involve these oxygen transfer reactions, and they can be improved with a fundamental understanding of the catalytic processes. So here's just, for example, a solid oxide fuel cell showing a bit more of a molecular level of the catalytic process. There's lots of steps involved in this process, and we're interested in understanding this on a fundamental atomic level. And we are interested in that because often the oxygen transfer steps in these processes are the rate limiting steps, so they're the slowest overall and slow down the entire thing. And so in this work, we're going to focus mostly on the CO oxidation reaction. So we're oxidizing carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide, and it's a sort of model reaction for probing these very fundamental processes. The other thing that's really instrumental to my thesis and to gaining this information is being able to visualize catalyst down to the atomic level and the catalytic process as well. So here's a catalytic converter showing sort of the catalyst exists across length scales all the way down to the nanometer level. And with aberration corrected electron microscopy, we can actually probe the atomic level structure of the catalyst. This is a platinum particle on a cerium oxide support. This is a really common formulation of catalysts that are used in these applications. Specifically, the cerium oxide is useful for it's reducible oxide, can actually contribute to the reaction by giving its oxygen and its crystal lattice to its sorbates during the mechanism. So I'll be talking about this quite extensively later in the presentation, but I just wanted to show sort of the mechanism of lattice oxygen transfer at the interface between the metal and the support. And so this is one of the things that we're really interested in understanding. There's a lot of questions ongoing about this. And one of the ways that we can actually get information about this is looking at the catalyst while it's doing the reaction. And so this is what we, when we start to introduce gas, reacting gases, and start to heat the catalyst up, we might say that we're looking at it in the situation or in situ that it's kind of used in. And in order to go a little bit further and get a direct correlation between the structure that we observe in the TEM and actual properties of the catalyst, we would actually want to measure something like the reaction products or the conversion. And a big part of my project has been to develop tools and apply those tools for operando electron microscopy, where we're directly measuring the reaction rate during atomic resolution imaging. And this allows us to get a very direct correlation between the functionality of the catalyst and the structure that we're imaging. So that's the sort of spirit of the first project that I'll talk about, which led to this publication in ultramicroscopy, where we're trying to understand under what conditions we can determine quantitatively the reaction rate or the chemical kinetics of the catalyst that we're imaging. And this is important because it's not exactly trivial to do this. The electron microscope, this is a schematic of an environmental transmission electron microscope where we do these experiments. And it allows us to put gas in the region around the sample. And the type of reactor that we use includes this furnace with a pellet, a catalyst-loaded pellet. And sort of motivation for this is that if you put a standard TM sample of catalyst in the microscope, there's a minuscule amount of catalyst on that sample. And the amount of products that are produced by that little amount of catalyst is not detectable. So we have to vastly increase the mass of catalyst that we put into the reactor. So we use this very high surface area pellet in a furnace. And the way that we detect the products under catalytic conditions is we can actually use the electron beam that we use for imaging to also probe the composition of the gas using electron energy loss spectroscopy. So this is essentially a method for looking at chemical signatures, for example, that in the TEM. And so here I'm showing that we're under increasing temperature, that we're measuring that the carbon monoxide that we emit into the cell is getting converted into carbon dioxide. So this tells us that the catalyst is active. And so the sort of motivation for this project is that we want to know to what extent does this gas composition measurement that we probe with the electron energy loss spectroscopy with the electron beam, how does that actually relate to the rate of the catalyst on the grid that we're imaging? That's what we want to know. So some of the questions that we want to address with this are, what are the gas and temperature distributions? You know, how homogeneous or how inhomogeneous are they? And how can eels, as I said, be used to evaluate the rate of the catalytic reaction and not just the gas phase composition? And so to this end, the goal is to establish a model of the ETEM reactor and to determine quantitative kinetic information from it. And so we do this by building a computational model of the ETEM reactor. So here's the pictures of the geometry of the entire cell. And here's a close-up. This is a holder, and this is the electron beam path. In this red region, you can see a close-up view of the reactor itself. Here's the pellet, and then in blue is the TEM grid, and then the eels line, again, the optic axis is that dashed line. And so to solve for the gas and temperature distributions and other properties of interest, we just subdivide this geometry into a mesh of finite elements and compute the solutions to physical equations along those elements. And so for this project, we applied it to ruthenium on silica catalyst, again, for CO oxidation. And just to, again, like give a general idea of what's going on here, gas is flowing into the environmental cell from the inlet, and there's catalyst loaded in the pellet, and we're going to increase the temperature of the furnace. The catalyst in the pellet is going to start to produce reactants. We're going to measure what the distribution of the products are. So here's the three-dimensional distribution of CO2 in the cell. This is close up to the reactor here. And this is for three different temperature set points, so three different increasing levels of activity. The catalyst is becoming more active, and there's more CO2 being produced as the catalyst becomes more active. And you can see that the gas phase composition is very uniform. There's not a lot of variation outside of the center of the reactor where the catalyst is located in the pellet. This is kind of to be expected because the catalyst is located in the pellet, and that's what's producing the CO2. So there's likely going to be an enrichment there. Um, Regardless of that, what we really want to know is how does the composition that we measure along the eels line relate to the composition and the rate at the TEM grid, because that's what we measure during the experiment and what we image. So we can look at this a little more quantitatively. And I'm also showing we had some experimental data from Ben Miller here. Our simulations agree very well with the experimental data. This gives us some confidence in the model. And you can see that the difference between the TM grid, which is the blue line, and the EELS measurement, which is the red line, is pretty minimal. It's about 8% relative difference for these conditions. And so this tells us that can provide an accurate measure of the gas composition surrounding the catalyst that's imaged on the TM grid. And then we can take this a step further and actually look at the catalytic reaction rate. You can determine the rate through integration in the model, and then you can also estimate the rate using the conversion and knowledge about how much reactant is going in. It tells you how much CO2 is produced, for example. And if we look at those two quantities, the rate at the grid is plotted in blue, and the rate that you would estimate through EELS is plotted in red. You can see that this is actually, I think, a really important result that's demonstrating the power of this model. If you were to just try to estimate the rate through the conversion, you can see that the conversion isn't necessarily linearly related to the actual rate. And so with this model, we can correct the rate that we would determine experimentally with the conversion and obtain the true rate at the grid and directly correlate the structure that we imaged during the experiment with the rate of the catalyst at the TM grid. And the reason for this discrepancy is that at those higher conversions, the product concentration becomes more concentrated around the TM grid and less concentrated along the path of the EELS line. So there's just this buildup of a difference, essentially at higher temperatures. Um, so yeah, with this tool, now we want to apply it to these platinum on Syria catalysts. So the next project that I'll talk about is actually using this to investigate the atomic level behavior of platinum on Syria catalysts for CO oxidation. And what we found is that there's dynamic atomic level behavior that correlates with the activity of the catalyst. So just a brief background into the material science and catalytic science of this material. Like I said earlier, there's this ability for cerium oxide to contribute its lattice oxygen during the catalytic reaction. And this is done by the catalytic cycling of oxygen vacancies. You can see here that the cerium oxide can accommodate vacancies through this cerium 3 plus 4 plus oxidation state change. And for platinum on Syria catalysts and a lot of metal on Syria catalysts, there's this special synergy at the metal support interface, so the perimeter of the interface between the metal and the support, where in this case, carbon monoxide that's absorbed onto the platinum nanoparticle interacts with oxygen at the interface and produces CO2. And this interfacial oxidation mechanism is believed to follow it's typically described as a Mars-Van Crevelen mechanism. But there's a lot of questions that are still outstanding about this mechanism. So for example, this is a highly simplified schematic that I made, and it's not meant to be exactly representative of what's going on. We don't really understand where the gas phase oxygen is reduced and reincorporated back into the lattice. We don't know if that takes place at the interface after CO abstracts oxygen and forms CO2, or if it takes place on the nearby support surface. We don't know what this process does to the nanoparticle. If there's this constant breaking of bonds and reforming of bonds, what does that do to the structure? So these are types of things that we want to investigate. And there's been some prior work in our group looking at cerium oxide nanoparticles, pure cerium oxide nanoparticles. This is a 1 second TM image, 1 second exposure TM image of a cerium oxide nanoparticle surface. And these bright columns are, these bright intensity features in the image are columns of cerium, and the fainter intensity features are columns of oxygen. And at these defect sites, these step edges, you can see that the cerium columns are actually diffuse relative to the neighboring terrace sites. And by looking at these structures with higher time resolution, you can actually see that those diffuse sites are displacing, they're moving around. And with some molecular dynamics work, they were able to show that when oxygen vacancies form, the nearby cerium is actually sort of repelled by that. It's moving away. And so we have this tool that allows us to investigate the oxygen vacancy dynamics by looking at what's happening to the cerium in the structure. So with this in mind, what we want to investigate are what are the structure activity relationships at platinum cerium interfaces during CO oxidation? What role do the surface sites near the metal support interface play? And what type of structural dynamics occur during CO oxidation, and how does this relate to the activity of the catalyst? Okay, so here's a time averaged image of 2 platinum nanoparticles on cerium oxide. This is under a CO oxidation reactant gas atmosphere at about 150 degrees Celsius. These are the platinum nanoparticles, and this is the cerium oxide support. The oxygen wasn't resolved in this experiment, but these bright intensity features are columns of cerium atoms. And using eels, we were in the model, we were able to determine the reaction rate at this condition. We found there's no measurable rate of reaction. I'll also just mention that in this project, we were interested in not only looking at the reaction rate, but looking at a quantity called the turnover frequency. This tells us on a per site basis how many times is one reaction turning over. So we'll just, it's basically the reaction rate, but normalized to an estimate of how many perimeter sites there are. So as we turn the temperature of the furnace up, the catalyst becomes more active and it starts to turn over more reactants. And so as we look at higher temperatures, this is 275 and 285 degrees. And these are the conversions and the turnover frequencies. You can see there's this change in the structure of the catalyst. So the sites are becoming a little more blurred on the surface, and the nanoparticle is becoming a little less visible. And so there's a couple of different features that emerge. There's the loss of the visibility. There's the blurring of these nearby cerium cations. And there's also, it's subtle, but we're able to measure it. There's an outward relaxation of this top surface layer. So it's actually expanding locally just on the surface. And so all of this is consistent with this oxygen exchange that I showed earlier. And it's consistent with this Marsden and Kreflin mechanism. But to go deeper into what's going on, we can actually correlate these observations with the turnover frequency that we're measuring. So I'll focus first on the nanoparticles. These are the 2 nanoparticles from before. We can quantify the degree of visibility, how visible are the fringes in those nanoparticles through this Fourier transform analysis. And basically this tells us how dynamic are those nanoparticles. The more dynamic they are, the less visible their fringes are going to be. So you can see that there's a clear correlation between the 2 nanoparticles' visibility and the turnover frequency. And this is telling us that as the catalyst becomes more active, there's this constant breaking and formation of bonds that destabilizes the nanoparticle. And so specifically the platinum bridging oxygen cerium interfacial bond, which is attributed to the bonding at the interface. We think that that is breaking and forming, leading to this dynamic behavior. And looking at the cerium, the nearby cerium surface, we looked at both the degree of blurring and the outward surface relaxation. So this is the cerium sites between the 2 platinum nanoparticles. at the three increasing turnover frequencies. And you can see that there's a correlation between the amount of blurring. So we know that those sites, again, are becoming more dynamic as the turnover frequency increases. Interestingly, though, in the bulk, you don't see this behavior. So we know that it's localized to the surface near the nanoparticles, near the metal support interface. So we think that because of this enhanced degree of blurring, we attribute this to an enhanced rate of oxygen vacancy creation and annihilation. Similarly, with the outward relaxation, there's a clear correlation with the turnover frequency. And this outward relaxation is due to a larger concentration of oxygen vacancy. So not only are they cycling faster, but the concentration of vacancies is also growing larger, leading to this sort of swelling of the surface locally. This sort of bond elongation also leads to strain in the material at the surface. And all of these factors together suggest that the oxygen reduction takes place on this highly reduced, highly strained cerium oxide surface near the metal support interface. Okay, so in conclusion, using this operando electron microscopy approach coupled with the model that I showed earlier in the first section, we're able to perform quantitative operando electron microscopy and derive information about the dynamic structure activity relationships for these metal on ceria catalysts. And we see in this case that the activity of the catalyst correlates with dynamic structural behavior, which leads to a destabilization of the platinum nanoparticle, as well as increased reduction in the nearby ceria surface. And overall, the results suggest that the molecular oxygen reduction takes place on this very highly reduced, strained ceria surface and perhaps not at the interface. And overall, this study highlights the importance of characterizing this atomic level behavior, characterizing the dynamics of that atomic level behavior in order to gain information about the structure-activity relationships. So now I'll talk about another really interesting project, which is how, so in the last project I was showing sort of this time average image of the nanoparticles, and we saw, okay, it's becoming more dynamic and it's becoming more blurred. But what we really want to know is what's happening there, not just that it's becoming more dynamic, but how is it becoming more dynamic? Can we describe it to more detail? And so recently there's been the development of these so-called direct electron detectors, which have much higher efficiencies and frame rates, allowing us to actually probe these reconfigurations on the millisecond time scale. And so a vast improvement over the detector technology that was used in the first project. So just to sort of ground these observations in some theoretical work, so I think that this is important to emphasize because there's this idea of catalytically active sites being a sort of, maybe you've heard of like a lock and key mechanism, but I think that we need to rethink this, and there's been some historical as well as recent work sort of reframing catalytic materials as this evolving ensemble of structures. So it's not just that there's a structure that's active, there's a structure that's less active. There are structures that are active and less active, but the catalyst is evolving through them all the time. There's varying degrees of activity that may exist at any time. This sort of, the reason for this is that, especially in small nanoparticles, there are many structures that exist with similar energies. And the barriers that separate those different structures are also small relative to the energies that are available, say for like thermal energy that's available to cross those barriers. So the catalyst structure can sort of fluctuate between lots of different isomers under reaction conditions. And this fluctuating behavior we call fluxionality, just to describe that it's a metastable system that's sort of fluctuating. And so being able to characterize this is really important, I think, for catalyst science. And like I said, with the development of direct electron detectors, which are running now at about 1,000 frames per second, we won't be able to see the like very fundamental picosecond timescale, atomic level rearrangements or hopping or diffusion that's going to happen, but we might be able to probe the longer lived metastable states that exist on with a lifetime on the order of the turnover frequency, which is, like millisecond to second time scale. So this is a really exciting opportunity that I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've applied this to platinum on Syria catalysts. And I'll just mention that there are some, like I said, theoretical work that's being developed in this field, but there's not a lot of experimental observations. And so I think we're trying to bridge that gap, so to speak. So a couple of different motivating questions for this part of the project are, can we track these dynamic structural reconfigurations? That's kind of an open question. Can we do that with high spatiotemporal resolution, high atomic resolution spatial information, and high temporal information as well? And then getting towards the catalysis science, how does the surrounding gas atmosphere around the catalyst influence the degree of these fluxional dynamic behavior? So to this end, we're going to apply this aberration-corrected environmental TM coupled with direct electron detectors to directly visualize the fluxional behavior. And so this work was done in collaboration at the time with Renu Sharma, who hosted me at NIST. And the first project that we did was also done in collaboration with Anatoly Frenkel at Brookhaven National Lab. And we were interested in looking at these platinum on Syria catalysts for the water gas shift reaction. That's this reaction down here where we're oxidizing carbon monoxide with water to form carbon dioxide as well as hydrogen. And this is an important avenue for producing hydrogen industrially. There's a lot of questions outstanding about what's going on at the atomic level and how does the interface play a role in this oxidation mechanism. So we looked at the catalyst. This is the same catalyst nanoparticle in first a carbon monoxide atmosphere, so this is pure CO at 200 degrees. And then we introduced water, which is the reactant gas atmosphere at under reaction conditions. So this is 200 degrees C as well. And this is a time averaged image. This is a 6-second movie. And this is the movie that I've sped up. I found that if you play it faster than the real time, you can actually see some finer detail that you wouldn't be able to see. And so it's really amazing. Actually, this was a bit surprising when we first started doing this project because the catalyst particle is just completely dynamic. There's this constant reconfiguration of the nanoparticle structure, most likely due to diffusion along the surface or to the evolution of less coordinated sites because of the bonding with CO and the gas. And when we introduce water, you can see that the particle is actually stabilized. So even in the time resolved movie, you can see lattice fringes in the platinum and atomic columns in the platinum. And over the time average image, which is higher signal to noise representation of the data, you can see that the nanoparticle is actually faceted. So there's these clear facets that emerge on the nanoparticle, and there's an enhanced degree of stability evidenced by the visible atomic columns. My speculative hypothesis for why this is happening is that in the water gas shift atmosphere, the water can compete for adsorption sites on the surface of the platinum with CO and kind of leave the coverage of CO less. And we think that the CO is what's driving the fluxionality in this case. So again, we can look at sort of time evolution of these structures. You can see, like I said, in CO, the structure is completely dynamic. There seems to be a sort of anchoring at the core of the nanoparticle, so dead in the center at the interface, the sort of buried core that's sort of surrounded by this very dynamic shell seems to be stabilized. And in the water gas shift atmosphere, you can see again, there's this emergence of faceting. Actually, the lattice fringes are bent in this water gas shift atmosphere. So there's some strain and displacement from the equilibrium bulk terminated lattice positions. And what's interesting about this as well is if you look at the interface, you can see with this yellow arrow, I've highlighted this perimeter site, which is dynamically appearing and disappearing. So in this case, over 1.5 seconds, you can see some faint intensity. Then clearly there's an atomic column present. And then here it's gone again. And so we know that these perimeter sites are behaving differently than other sites on the nanoparticle. And this information, in addition to information obtained from the collaborators with other techniques, helped us to understand the mechanism for this reaction. And that was published in this paper, which I don't have much time to talk about. Instead, I'm going to talk about some other work that we did looking at a different platinum on Syria catalyst in CO and oxygen, as well as in nitrogen. So these are the same platinum nanoparticle on Syria, imaged in nitrogen at the top. So this is a relatively inert, it's 80% of the atmosphere, nitrogen gas, as well as carbon. Then we switch the gas atmosphere to carbon monoxide and oxygen. And you can see that the behavior is like vastly different in the two cases. In nitrogen, you can see even in the time series, there's very clearly resolved atomic columns. There's a marked degree of stability. And then when we switch the gas atmosphere to CO and oxygen, the particle behaves completely differently. And a couple of different important things that I want to point out are that in nitrogen, you can see that the surface and the bulk lattice are well aligned. But then when we look at the same structure in the CO and oxygen atmosphere, if you follow these red lines up to the surface, you can see that the lines intersect the lattice positions in the bulk, but then at the surface, the sites are actually displaced from the line. So there's this shearing that occurs on the surface. And we think that this shearing is due to a shear plane forming due to the clustering of oxygen vacancies. So when there's a large concentration of vacancies, they can actually cluster together and lead to the structure shearing in order to reduce the energy. And then if we want to understand what's happening here, we have to actually begin to understand what structures are occurring in these different environments over time and be able to describe them. So here's just one sort of highlight of that effort. You can see this is now, I'm summing the time series to 100 milliseconds time resolution. It was taken at 40 frames per second, and now we're summing it to 10 frames per second. And in this case, you can see that there is a moment of relative stability or metastability for the nanoparticle, even though it's only a couple hundredths of a second. There's some clearly visible contrast in the region corresponding to the platinum nanoparticle. So it's at least stable over that time frame for us to be able to image it without this blurring effect, these motion artifacts. However, at 200 milliseconds later, you can see that there's this much less stable state that the particle is going through, evidenced by the fact that you cannot even see the particle. So it's dynamically reconfiguring so fast that we're not able to resolve the lattice fringe information. There's a slight amount of intensity that's visible at the interface, and at the same time, it's not so visible on the projector, but on my computer in the image analysis software, you can actually see there's a diffuse sort of character to those sites at the surface, the cerium cation sites at the surface that would be in contact with the platinum nanoparticle. And so we think there's this interplay between the metal support interface and the platinum surface that's leading to this dynamic fluxional behavior. And just for those who are interested, I wanted to mention that in the previous work, I was talking about collaboration with different techniques. They were probing the structure with X-ray absorption spectroscopy. And we know from those measurements that the particle is not disordered or amorphous. It's actually, those signatures are consistent with the FCC structure. So it's not that the particle is not crystalline anymore. It's that it's reconfiguring so fast that we just can't track it with this time resolution. The signal to noise is not high enough for us to resolve whatever structures occur over that time. So this is a huge intellectual challenge, I would say, for our field. And one way that we've tried to approach getting quantitative structural information out of this type of data is through modeling and simulation. And so this work was done by Claire during an honors thesis. And the sort of approach that we've developed is, let's simplify the problem very immensely. Let's just consider that the particle, the platinum particle, is just rotating on the support. There's a lot of other effects that we think are going on, but to a first degree, let's see if we can, reproduce the experimental observations by just focusing on bulk rigid body like rotations. And so here's an example of three structures where we have a platinum particle on a cerium oxide support, and the particle is undergoing different degrees of rotation. We can simulate the images that correspond to these structures. And our sort of guiding hypothesis is that if we average those simulations together, then we might get something that's like the, or approximately like the time averaged image that we would take during an experiment where structures are undergoing multiple reconfigurations during one acquisition. And so here's the average, and then we just simulate noise as well. So Claire's done a lot of work into comparing these simulated time averages to the experiment, and they work well in some cases and they don't work well in other cases. For example, the interface, where we think there's maybe dynamics that aren't bulk rigid body rotations occurring. And so for more information on this, I would defer you to her thesis. Okay, so in conclusion with this work, we've applied these aberration-corrected electron microscopy tools with direct electron detectors to visualize these fluxional behaviors that are occurring in these reactant gas atmospheres. And one major conclusion from this is that for 1 to 2 nanometer supported series supported platinum nanoparticles, the shape, the equilibrium shape, is not well defined in the atmosphere, evidenced by this constant reconfiguration that we observe. Also the 2 observations in CO were done at 2 different temperatures. This was done at 200 and this was done at 20 degrees. And the similar qualitative behavior leads us to believe that the carbon monoxide platinum on ceria gas solid interaction is the driving force for this dynamic reconfiguration and not necessarily the temperature. Introducing water to the CO atmosphere moderates the dynamics, leading to stabilization of the nanoparticle and faceting. And overall, these results provide insight into this atomic level fluxional behavior that occurs on these reducible oxide supported metal nanoparticle catalysts. Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that was inspired by trying to understand the structures that we see in these time-resolved image series. And ascertaining the structure is a major obstacle to scientific analysis, primarily because the images are so noisy. And as we go to faster and faster time resolutions, there's going to be less and less signal in each frame of the time series. And so we need to develop very adequate denoising approaches that allow us to recover some of that information maybe by estimating the signal. And so this work was done in collaboration with some data scientists who specialize in machine learning at NYU and Cornell, and we're trying to develop deep convolutional neural networks to denoise these time-resolved TM images. And so one thing that kind of separates us from, why don't we just apply sort of standard routine denoising approaches? The issue is that the images are just severely corrupted by noise. So they're much noisier than images that are typically encountered in electron microscopy. And so we have to sort of develop novel approaches to deal with that. Additionally, we're also interested in what's going on at the surface of the nanoparticle. So a lot of approaches leverage sort of periodic information. You can discard high frequency information that's attributed to noise and keep low frequency information that's attributed to the structure. But this breaks down when you're trying to look at abruptly terminated surfaces or defects or slight displacements of individual sites. So we have to really think about approaches that maintain high spatial resolution as well. So to that end, we're kind of working with these convolutional neural networks. There's which are developed primarily by data scientists at NYU and Cornell to denoise these images. And the sort of way that they work is we're training them on simulated data. So we have a large batch of simulations, and we can make those simulations noisy. So we have what we call the noisy image and the ground truth simulation. We feed the noisy image into the network, and the network is this convolutional neural network. So it's looking at regions of spatial regions in the noisy image and trying to, it convolves them into data. And I'll just mention later, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but there's a number of different convolutional layers that are built up into the network. And in the end, it's basically a mathematical function that maps the noisy image to a prediction of what the denoise signal is. And this is an example where it's actually done a good job. But in general, it needs to be trained and improved. So we do that by comparing the prediction with the ground truth and iteratively adjusting the parameters in the network until we achieve better and better performance. Since this is a denoising problem, I'll mention that on these counted electron detectors, the noise is limited by shot noise, and that can be modeled as a Poisson distribution. So some of the questions that we want to address with this work are, what are the best architectures for doing this? That's not a given, and we need to investigate that. How robust are the networks to unseen imaging conditions? If we feed it networks at a particular defocus, is it going to work on other images of a different defocus? And then something that's really important for us, because the images are so noisy that we can't quite ascertain the structure, we need a way of quantifying the degree of uncertainty with the denoised image. So we need a way of quantifying the agreement between the original noisy observation and what's coming out of the network. And then finally, can we actually understand how these networks are denoising our images? Can we ascertain or access those mechanisms and use them to inform us to make better networks? So we're going to leverage these convolutional neural networks to denoise our images. So like I had mentioned before, we were leveraging multi-slice image simulations to generate a training set. The network needs a very large quantity of data to train, 10,000 images, 1,000 images, in order to go through that iteration an adequate number of times. And so I won't go into much detail about this. I wanted to thank Dr. Ramon Manzoro for providing a lot of assistance with the model generation and the image simulation. But we've included a lot of different variety of platinum nanoparticle structures and rotations and size of the support thickness, as well as electron optical parameters in order to encompass a large variety of different image and structural parameters for our data set. What I want to talk about in more depth is some of the sort of lessons that we've learned. One of them was that we need to tune the receptive field of the network, or the field of view, appropriately to achieve good denoising performance. And the receptive field, like I said, there's multiple convolutional layers in this network. So the receptive field is basically how big is the original area that eventually gets fed into the smallest layer of the network. It's kind of like, what does the network look at when it's denoising these images? And we originally started with a small receptive field of about 40 by 40 pixels. And you can see in these images that with this size of receptive field, it's pretty hard to differentiate structure from different parts of the image. And when you add noise, it's pretty much impossible to differentiate one region of the image from another. But if we increase the receptive field, we can actually see that even in the clean image, you can see very clearly that this region corresponds to the vacuum, this corresponds to the surface, and this to the bulk. And when we add the same content of noise, you can see even in the noisy image that there's some sort of ability to differentiate even by eye what's going on and where you are, say, in the image. Um, and so we did some benchmarking with these different receptive fields. The final receptive field that we chose was 800 by 800. And so here's a ground truth simulated image and the noisy input. And the way that we quantify the performance is through the PSNR, and you can see it's going up as we increase the receptive field. Um, so the second thing I want to talk about in this project before I wrap it up is how we can how can we trust what's coming out of the network. So the network actually performed very well on our data. This is the noisy input, and this is the output of the network. And you can see that it qualitatively is almost identical to the ground truth image that we fed in. So it took this and produced this, and it's very, very close to the truth. But in some cases, there were the loss of or the generation of spurious atomic columns on the surface. And this is a big issue for us because that's what we want to study. We're interested in the catalytic properties that occurs on the surface. So if there's spurious columns appearing on the surface, it would be bad. So can we detect this? So we've come up with a way based on the statistical likelihood of mapping out the likelihood of those atomic columns being present based on the noisy observation that we fed it. And so I'll defer the details here, but essentially what this does is it gives us an atomic column by atomic column representation of how likely these structures are to be real given the intensity that's present in the noisy image. And so for other applications, I know, Brent, that you're interested in applying this to some of your data, I would be interested to talk about, how would this be generalizable to cases where there aren't atomic columns present, but maybe some other structure of interest that you're trying to extract from the denoised images. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll keep going. I'll just conclude this section by saying that we've developed this convolutional neural network to denoise ultra low signal to noise images, and that the receptive field was a really important parameter to improve the performance. And as the noise becomes more severe, the receptive field has to become larger. And then we can quantify the agreement between the denoise structure and the noisy observation using these statistical likelihood maps. And I didn't have time to go into this, but we are also able to understand how the network is denoising in different regions of the image. Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk about some research paths forward, which is mostly the exciting stuff that I wish I could do if I had more time. So one of those is really pushing this deep learning denoising further. I think that we want to study these catalysts at the highest time resolution possible. A major limitation is that the data is too noisy for us to even think about mentally. So we need to come up with new ways of denoising that so we can visualize these structures. There's some different approaches that we've been developing based on unsupervised methods. So this is not using simulations, it's just training on the data itself. And that's led to this paper that's being revised right now. And another sort of innovative aspect of this is that we're not denoising on a frame by frame basis, but we're looking at frames in the movie and using information from adjacent frames to improve the performance. And then one other avenue that I think would be really interesting to investigate would be to investigate the particle size and gas pressure dependence of this fluxional behavior. So we think that the CO pressure is the driving, the interaction between the CO gas and the structure is what's driving the fluxional behavior. And that this fluxional behavior is going to be modulated depending on the percentage of interfacial sites or different defect sites on the surface. So by varying the particle size, we can change the sort of percentage of those sites and the overall number of atoms in the structure. And by increasing the gas pressure, we might be able to sort of slowly or gradually introduce fluxional behavior at different sites and try to understand it a sort of case-by-case basis. Okay, so that is my defense talk. I'll just summarize by stating that the finite element model that we've developed has allowed us to perform quantitative operando TEM by allowing us to probe the catalytic reaction rate with eels, so we get this direct correlation between structure and activity. Applying that tool to platinum on ceria showed that the activity of the catalyst correlates with dynamic behavior at the platinum-ceria interface, the platinum nanoparticle, and the surrounding ceria surface. These results implicate those platinum-oxygen-cerium interfacial bonds as being involved in the interfacial oxygen transfer process. And then applying aberration-corrected electron microscopy with a fast direct electron detector allowed us to begin to probe exactly what's going on with those dynamic structural reconfigurations. And we applied that to the water gas shift reaction, CO oxidation reactions. And then sort of to improve this methodology, we need more robust denoising methods, which we're working on using convolutional neural networks to do. And so overall, this work, my thesis, is sort of contributing to both our ability to study as well as our present understanding of structure-activity relationships for oxide-supported nanoparticle catalysts. And so with that, I'll just thank everyone here for supporting me, Peter for being a great mentor, my committee members, Brent, Jimmy, Chris, and Arunima, and as well as the collaborators, Anatoly Frankel, collaborators at NYU and Cornell, especially Carlos, who's leading the denoising, Claire Block, who did the work in the fluxional section, and Renu Sharma, who hosted me at NIST twice to do some of that work, as well as the NSF and my wife, Rue, for being the best. And so that's all. Yeah, thanks so much for being here, and I would be really happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much.